in 1891 and the 1916 Rising. And during that period of infighting among Irish nationalists, the civil war that followed Parnell's death among the Home Rule Party leadership, during that recent time, two men founded a new movement, the Gaelic League. They were Eoin MacNeill, a professor of history, a native of Glenarm in this district, an alumnus of St Malachy's College, Belfast, and the other was Dr Douglas Hyde, the son of the Church of Ireland clergyman in County Roscommon. And together they established a non-political, non-sectarian movement, the aim of which was to conserve and preserve the Irish language as the spoken language of the people. And it was against this background, of course, that Faith in the Land was founded at the turn of the century. In fact, it was to this district in 1904 that a number of people radicalised by the Gaelic League, many of them Protestant home rulers, or simply unionists with an interest in the Irish language, arrived with the notion of preserving Irish as spoken in the Glens. One of them was, of course, Francis Joseph Bigger, a Belfast solicitor, a wealthy man, immersed in the Gaelic League, immersed in the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. He had led an expedition of the Naturalist Field Club, of Belfast kind of intellectuals and middle-class businessmen to Glenarm in 1897 to hear the Irish language spoken. And he wrote a report on this, which are preserved in his papers in Belfast Central Library. I'll just give you a few sentences. He writes of his visit, his journey from Parkmore Station, where the group of 30 or 40, mainly Protestant people interested in Irish, descended the Glen by Charlemont, speaking to people in the fields as they approached Bunanishka Waterfoot. And he records, "We were soon greeted by Irish speakers who recognised us. Henry Macaulay of Clonmara, a good Irish speaker, came from his field to bid us welcome. In Waterfoot we met a teacher, shoemaker, peddler, all of whom were able to converse with us in fluent Irish. It was a good day," he wrote, "for the Irish language." And thus began F.J. Bigger's association with the Glens mantra. It was he who spent his money and considerable resources in encouraging local dancers, singers, pipers, fiddlers, and of course the traditional game of hurling. It was Bigger who introduced the GAA into the Glens in 1903 and launched the first hurling team, Shane O'Neill's, at that time. And of course, other personalities were involved in the formation of the Glen station as well. One was Sir Roger Casement, a scion of the Casement family of Mahon and Temple House, just outside this town, a family traditionally associated with landlordism and unionism. Casement had become a distinguished British diplomat, and he arrived in Glenarm in 1904, just after his exposure of the Putumayo atrocities, when he was at the height really of his fame as a great humanitarian. Indeed, we have a record of the very moment of Casement's conversion, if you like, to the Gaelic ideal. It comes in a letter from Eoin MacNeill's sister, Mrs. McGaffin of Glenarm, who was writing to her brother, Professor MacNeill in Dublin, in March 1904. This is what she writes about the meeting in Cushendall Schoolhouse to organise the first fetch in March 1904. She writes, "Mr. John Clark, Ben Moore we mentioned, the cousin of our esteemed Chairman Seamus Clark, who can't be with us tonight. Mr. Clark told me that at the meeting on Sunday week in Cushendall, he said a few words about the movement, and when he'd finished, a tall, soldierly man came over to him and said, 'I agree heartily with all you have said. These have been my own thoughts for years.' Mr. Clark thought no more of the incident, but on Friday last he got a letter from the gentleman telling him that he had heard of the little manuscript paper that had been started in the Glens to promote the Irish language, and enclosing a few verses on the Irish language for the March number. He is greatly interested in the fish, this gentleman. Hopes he will be here at the time, but as he is going to South Africa soon, he fears he may have to leave before the 30th of June. He subscribes £5. And then Mrs. McGaffin told Eoin MacNeill, Mr. Clark says he can hardly believe that a casement of Ballycastle could hold such views. They were tyrants in the old days. So here we have a record of Roger Casement's transition from, if you like, big house unionism and ascendancy politics to the Gaelic world of the Glens of Antrim and to the world of Irish nationalism and separatism, of course, which was to lead to his execution on the 3rd of August 1916. And thirdly, we have a group of aristocratic Antrim women who were very much at the foundation of the Foundation of Land in 1904. And as has been mentioned by PJ and Miriam earlier, this was a period when women were just emerging from that kind of sort of separate spheres kind of view, that men controlled the world of work, politics and war, and women were confined to the home, morality, the domestic sphere. It wasn't until 1918 that Irish women, or indeed British women, received the Westminster franchise for the first time. And yet, at the foundation of the Foundation of Land, we had 3 women, all from big house unionist backgrounds in the Glens of Antrim. We had Miss Ada McNeill of Cushendun, who preferred the Irish form of her name, Egypt. She was the secretary of the first Fish Committee and was a member of it until well into the 1930s. The McNeill family, and these were sort of big house McNeills from Cushendun, divided politically. For as she moved further towards nationalism, even republicanism, she found that her cousin Ronald McNeill, who was a unionist MP and a leading, in fact he was the man who signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact as British Foreign Minister in 1929. He was her cousin, and she found herself increasingly excluded from the family circle in Cushendun. And of course, there was Miss Margaret Dobbs, mentioned earlier by Patrick Clarkin, who served on the Fish Committee with her. Margaret Dobbs, who had a very long life, she was in her 90s when she died in 1962, was one of the Dobbs of Castle Dobbs. Her family were high sheriffs of Antrim and Louth, were aristocrats, were members of Castle's Unionist Party. Her brother organised the alarm gun running for the UBF in 1913. Yet Margaret Dobbs gravitated towards the Irish language and indeed Irish nationalism. She became a great Irish scholar, publishing many articles on the language, not just on the dialect spoken in the Glens, but on Irish traditions, folklore, and indeed Irish sources. Indeed, she argued, and I quote her, that Ireland without the Irish language is quite meaningless. And thirdly, there was Rose Young, or as she favoured to call herself, Rush the